Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're about to get started. So my name is Mindy Tarlow. I'm the director of the Mayor's Office of Operations. And one of the privileges I have in this administration is to be one of the keepers of the equity lens, or the equity focus. And I thought I would introduce this panel by just giving a little sense of what we mean by that, what we mean by focusing on equity, what we mean by governing with equity. And I guess the first thing to say is we think of equity in the de Blasio administration as something fairly broad. You know, most people just think of reducing income inequality or raising the floor on wages, which of course are critically important to making a more equitable city. But as you govern with equity, you have to think beyond that. You have to think about equitable access to services, equitable delivery of services, whether that's day-to-day services, basic services like clean streets or clean parks, or whether it's urgent services for our most vulnerable populations. That's the sort of broad definition of equity that we work with. And some of that is manifested in some of the signature initiatives of this administration, whether it's pre-K for all, or IDNYC, or affordable housing. But it's really not just about initiatives, it's about a way of thinking. And when we say focus on equity, what we mean is filtering our decisions through an equity lens, asking the question every time we make a decision, is this going to create a more equitable city? Is this something that's going to advance equity for all New Yorkers? And a lot of people, when they think about cities, don't think about that we can really make a lot of our own decisions, because you think it's just the crazy federal government that drives everything that we do. But the fact is, we make budget decisions every day. We make hiring decisions every day. We make procurement decisions every day, and they can all be done through an equity lens. And this forum is another example of how we promote equity in this city. Every time we put out a big public document, every time we have a major forum, we want to take the opportunity to infuse that document or forum with an equity lens. And I'm really happy to be here because I think Parks Without Borders is walking that talk. And really not only just to have a panel on equity, but that it's a theme throughout the day, throughout all the panels here. So it's really a pleasure to have been given the opportunity to introduce this panel. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, who will take it from here, John Rudolph, Feet in Two Worlds and the New School.
Thank you, Mindy. Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. I think we're going to have a great conversation. As Mindy said, I run a project here at the New School called Feet in Two Worlds. We're a journalism and media outlet. We focus on immigrants and immigration, and we work with journalists who are immigrants to help them get their stories out to public radio and online media. And there's kind of a parallel to what we do and what Mindy was talking about in terms of equity, because journalism generally, public radio specifically, is not a particularly diverse place. And so we work every day with organizations that say they want to have more diverse staffs of reporters and editors, but don't really know how to do it. And we cultivate talent, and we bring people to them who are incredibly talented journalists from immigrant communities and help get them jobs in these mainstream media outlets. The other thing I want to say just before we start is I'm also a product of New York City Parks. I grew up in this neighborhood, and I just want to tell you a very brief story. So as a kid, I spent a lot of time in Washington Square Park. It was 1992. I was covering the Clinton campaign. Bill Clinton had a rally in Washington Square Park. And I'd been traveling all around the country with the traveling press corps, and we're standing underneath the arch, and I invited my mother, and in those days, you could have your mother come with you and be in the press area. And Bill was like 2 hours late, and we're all milling around, and at some point, one of the reporters from, I think, the AP said, "Where are we anyway?" I said, oh, this is Washington Square Park. I grew up in this neighborhood. And my mother overheard, and she said, "Oh, yes, and there's the playground where Johnny used to play." So completely blowing my cover as a mature member of the press corps. Anyway, I want to introduce very briefly our panel. Jennifer Gardner, aptly named, is a senior planner at the New York City Parks Department. Dylan House is the community design director at the Hester Street Collaborative. And Isabel Baptista, one of my colleagues at the Milano School, also my office mate, who does a much better job of decorating her side of the office than I have done with mine, is an assistant professor at the Milano School. So I want to start with kind of a very broad question, but specifically focused on parks. What do we mean when we talk about equity and parks? And maybe, Dylan, you'd like to start. Yeah, turn it on. There you go.
Hello? Okay. So when I think about equity in parks, I think very broadly. I think one of the things that's really important is that community voices are driving decision-making around things like design, things like programming, things like advocacy for funding for parks. So a lot of our work at Hester Street Collaborative is creating tools and resources for participation in decision-making. Yeah.
Participation in decision-making. So can you give us a specific example of how that works?
And I'll show you in a little bit. But,
Yes, you will.
In terms of like the capital design process, one of the things that is not so well kept secret is the Parks Department doesn't have a lot of capital funding. They don't have a budget for that unless it's allocated by elected officials. So one way to build community leadership is to give community groups and stewardship groups the ability to advocate for funding and the resources and information to do that effectively. And that can help drive the conversation about what a park might look like if they're advocating for renovation.
So giving people a voice in the design of the park, but also in the funding stream for the renovation?
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Jennifer Gardner, when you think about equity as a senior planner in the Parks Department, what are the sort of like the top 5 things that you're checking off on your list?
That's a good way to put it. I think maybe beyond just me as a planner, the New York City Parks Department is thinking about equity really first and foremost as a question of fairness. And I think we've heard about that through the morning's discussions already in the ways that can play out. And one key thing that we've been doing for years, before we even started working on things like Parks Without Borders and the Community Parks Initiative, is thinking about access from the perspective of physical proximity. So like our quarter-mile walk goal, we're trying to ensure that every New Yorker has reasonable walking access to a park, and that's something we're continuing to try to move the needle on. We're thinking about things like universality in design, so making sure that our playgrounds and parks are accessible to everyone and offer a lot of different kinds of amenities. And then on the sort of inclusion side, that Dylan just sort of spoke to, we're also thinking about ways to expand our process to include a lot of voices that didn't necessarily have access to that process before. And then, of course, there's the resources side, and a big part of that is quality, and something that we're trying to address through, again, Parks Without Borders and CPI and our broader design approach that is really looking at making amenities in parks more diverse and more inclusive and more responsive to what communities actually need. And then, of course, we're thinking about who. So, bringing people into the process and making sure that we're sharing that decision-making sort of equitably, broadly across the city.
So is it partly a question of actual acreage or square footage per community that you're looking at?
We have like there are a lot of different ways that you can think about kind of the level of service that the Parks Department provides, or that any park system in a city would offer. And one way to do that is to look at the open space ratio. And it's kind of like a wonky way of saying, like, do you have to fit all of the people in your apartment building into like a park the size of a parking space, or do you have something more expansive? And I don't know, we have like seeker and sort of environmental review rules that we have to meet when new projects are built, but we're really focusing on that walk to a park measure.
So does that then imply a redistribution or an expansion of park areas in neighborhoods that are considered now underserved and away from neighborhoods that meet the criteria for the distance walk to the park or the number of square feet or acres?
I think that the acquisition of new property is something that we are looking to do in targeted ways where that's a possibility. But I think, as we also have heard in other parts of the conversation so far today, that's not always possible in growing dense neighborhoods. So we have strategies that look at multi-use spaces. So we have kind of a long history of jointly operated playgrounds, and how can we open up existing open spaces that might not be something that communities have access to right now, but could if we opened the gates of a schoolyard, for example.
Anna, your experience comes from across the river.
Yes, I'm the interloper here from New Jersey.
Tell us about it.
But I promise you it's still relevant. And my thoughts on equity and parks come from growing up in Newark and fighting for the creation of parks out of industrial lands, and in addition to thinking about access and participation in the process, I also think about communities seeing themselves in parks and feeling like they have a stake in that park, and that there's spaces for them to tell their stories, to express their history and their culture through those public spaces. And for unfortunately for many communities that have been historically marginalized from public spaces, I think that's really, really important, is feeling like you are of and part of a park, that you have a right to a park, and in telling its history and the struggle to create those parks, but also to have access to them once they're built, which is a big struggle today, for communities who have long suffered from lack of parks, that get parks and then get pushed out. And so that's a big thing in the back of my mind now is, how do we continue to hold a place and a space for all people to have a stake in a park in both a physical way and a historical way? And how do we be more intentional? I heard this word a lot in the earlier panel, and I think we'll hear it a lot going forward, is intentionality, right? In the building, in the planning, in the programming, and also in our imaginations about how we think about parks, is intentionality.
So similar to what Mindy was talking about in her introduction, you have to be thinking about this at every step of the process, and after the park is built, in the programmatic elements of the park.
Yeah.
All three of our panelists have presentations that they'd like to share with you now. So let's see, Jennifer, I think you are up first, so if you'd like to start that, great.
Great. So, from the parks perspective, I'm going to share an example of kind of our key equity-focused initiative, and talk through kind of from the systems level in a way, and try not to get too wonky in the process, but that's sort of what I do. So what we're trying to do is ensure that all New Yorkers have access to great parks. So this is our big sort of equity statement, and the Community Parks Initiative is our first kind of specifically designed program that's intended to address the issue of equity within the park system directly. So what are we actually doing? We launched CPI, which is the acronym we use a lot, in the fall of 2014, so it's now in its second year. CPI is a $285 million capital program that's aiming to transform and then also sustain nearly 70 parks that are small, historically underinvested neighborhood parks and playgrounds. We wanted to put these sort of initial concentrated efforts in thinking about equity into parks and neighborhoods that would benefit from them most. So in order to do that, we had to look at the system citywide and take a data-driven approach that also took into account neighborhoods and neighborhood composition and people who would actually be planning and redeveloping those parks with us. And we were seeking to reduce some of the inequities that we had seen introduced into the park system over the past few decades. So the goal really is to create these vibrant, inclusive, well-designed, exciting park spaces that have started to pop up in a lot of neighborhoods, but that we knew weren't available in every neighborhood, because the reality, the evidence shows that not every one of our park spaces has been as well cared for over the course of the last 2 decades, which is the measure that we, the sort of frame of reference that we used when we dug into the details. So in terms of what capital investment looks like, we thought that we wanted to understand better what the historic trends were, to give some explanation to what we were seeing, the good park and the bad park, the sort of tale of two playgrounds. We saw that at the time we were doing this analysis in 2014, we had 400 active projects, so a huge amount of work that was actually going into the park system, and a lot of dollars that had been spent over those 2 decades. So we knew that we were improving the parks, but we weren't exactly sure where. And in looking at where the projects had played out across the city map, focusing in on those orange dots on the map, you even start to see that those parks that had less than $250,000 worth of investment began to seem like they might even be concentrated in certain neighborhoods. And we wanted to understand, how to further prioritize a program and understand where we would be working. So again, that was about 215 parks, those orange dots. So it was a substantial part of our portfolio that we knew we hadn't really paid that much capital investment attention to. So we knew that we would need to prioritize because $285 million is a lot, but it's not the $1 billion worth of need that we estimated might be required. So we looked at a lot of different demographic indicators that we wanted to help us point to neighborhoods that could give us a definition for what need actually is. So we ended up landing on 3 key criteria. One was looking at population growth. We wanted to see where neighborhoods had been growing. One was looking at density. We wanted to see where people already were, and these 2 things combined give you a sense of demand on park spaces. So one way to look at the equity lens, look through the equity lens. And then the last thing we looked at was, that we landed on really, was poverty. So we wanted to focus on neighborhoods that had a high number of individuals living below the poverty level. And that was, something that we saw could stand in as a proxy for a lot of other types of characteristics, health outcomes, for example. So just to quickly kind of go through a little more in the program development side, we landed we selected a number of sites for this program based on that alignment of neighborhoods of high need and sites of high need, so capital plus neighborhood. And ended up focusing on 47 initial parks. So the scope of the program were really, we had to narrow down from many, many parks. We're still continuing to add to this list of capital project sites. They're concentrated in neighborhoods that let us also implement some other programmatic activities that are sort of rounding out the impact of the capital funding. And I think because we have little time for this, so we can come back to talking about what some of those impacts are. But just thinking about the capital side right now, each of these capital projects, so back to that walk to park measure, we're reaching 312,000 New Yorkers from who have a quarter-mile walk radius to each of these capital sites. And about 31% of those have household incomes below the poverty level. So we're really delivering on kind of what we set out to do. And I would love to talk about how we're doing that, but maybe we can come back to these so that we can make sure everybody has time.
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about Hester Street Collaborative and what we do, we're a community-based planning and design organization, so we're a nonprofit, and we work sort of as a resource ally or a technical assistance provider to community-based organizations and groups, and in this in-between space between those groups and government or design and planning firms. So creating resources and tools for those different constituencies to kind of talk to each other. And we've been working in Chinatown in the Lower East Side, where we're based, for almost 15 years around these issues of how you engage people in the design process around public parks. So we started out by creating different sort of tools and activities that could be based on games or storytelling as a way to engage people that might not normally, say, come to a community board meeting in the design process. So these are just some of those tools. And that kind of grew into People Make Parks, which is a toolkit we created with Partnerships for Parks that is not just those sort of design and input gathering tools, but helps to explain the capital process and how communities can be involved in that from before there's funding through after a park reopens, after it's been renovated, and trying to find different ways in that very long, couple of year process to do that. And I kind of wanted to show an example of that that we've been working on the Lower East Side. So since 2007, we've been working in partnership with several organizations like Good Old Lower East Side, Two Bridges Neighborhood Council, around these issues of development on the waterfront. And waterfront access and better waterfront parks were a concern of that community. And it's a community that is largely public housing, it's largely affordable housing, and it's been pressured by issues of gentrification, lack of quality open space, aren't like really grassy green areas for people to go, places for young people, and activities for young people. So these are some of the current concerns we were having or hearing. We worked with these groups to develop like a community vision for piers that were formerly industrial on the waterfront. And this is one of the tools that we used to help people understand both where that park was. It's not a park yet, it will be a park. It's separated from the community by the FDR, so there's like a huge psychological barrier and an accessibility barrier in terms of actually getting there. So this is called the Waterfront on Wheels. It's actually a model on a bike trailer that we biked around the neighborhood, took to parks, took to schools, took to community meetings to have these conversations. And working with young people, they could build models and then working with the master planning architecture firm Matthews Nielsen, who's ultimately designing this park, we translated some of those designs into what became the design for the actual future park. Over the last 3 years, since before and during the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, we've been thinking about how you can activate this space and continue to have these conversations around advocacy for funding, advocacy for better design. So we've built an interim park called Paths to Pier 42, working in partnership with these different groups, bringing in the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council to commission artists to work with the community, to work with tenant leaders, youth programs, to build out this space. And provide community programming, both at the site and then out in the community, in the neighborhood, because breaking down these barriers of accessibility and the FDR Drive. So these are just some of the projects that were there, some of the events and programming. And this is all part of like a larger conversation we've been having around resiliency on the waterfront, and it's all kind of like tied together, because we started this conversation before Sandy, but when that event happened, obviously all of New York was affected, but particularly this neighborhood. So this conversation sort of kind of infused into that Paths to Pier 42 program, and that became a platform to talk about these issues of climate change and resiliency and the planning process for the large Lower Manhattan and East Side coastal resiliency projects, which will build flood protection barriers along the waterfront. So that got incorporated into Pier 42 and all around the Lower East Side. So it's not just about participation in the process, but it's about building long-term community leadership in these planning processes so people have a stake in what happens in the future of their neighborhood. And I think my time is up on that one. And we can continue that conversation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm going to tell you a really fabulous story about a beautiful park in Newark, if I can find it. Anyway, so I'm going to tell you, I think, a story about a park in Newark, New Jersey that I was part of a large group in helping to not just build it, but dream about it, fight for it, build it, program it, and now really keep it in active use and engagement. So I'm very, very proud of this story because it really feels like the park, the idea of this park grew as I grew up in the same neighborhood. So I lived 2 blocks from this park. So it really feels like a really wonderful fairy tale in some cases. When I look at this park, I think, wow. And I think it's a good example of how you can think about issues not just of equity but of social justice, of environmental justice and race and issues of marginalization through a space, through a physical space. So I think there's some lessons here that I think we can take away, and I'm still thinking about them. And for those of you who don't know where Newark is, I know that's nobody here, everybody knows. We are your neighbor to the west, and this wonderful riverfront park is along the Passaic River, 17 beautiful miles of the Passaic River that flow through the city of Newark and into the New York, New Jersey Harbor estuary. So we're not too far away. We're about a 30-minute path ride, and I encourage you all to come see our beautiful park. And I have to admit that this presentation comes out of a collaboration with my partner in crime, Damon Rich, who was the urban designer in the city of Newark at the time that we built this park and dreamed about it. And we did this presentation actually at the APA to talk about a racially just and environmentally robust example of how you can think of, dream of, and build a park. And Damon was really essential in that. You know, it was a real partnership between the city of Newark and community organizations like the one I worked for called the Ironbound Community Corporation, who struggled to try to advocate for building a park, but then when the moment came to actually build it, we had wonderful partners in the city and also in the people like Trust for Public Land and many others that helped collaborate to make it happen. And so one of the first things that we did, I'm going to skip over the sort of long 20-year history of struggle to build a park on a waterfront that was largely industrial, largely forgotten and forgotten about and discarded, and the environmental justice struggles around that, a community with no park space, high density, not a lot of access to outdoors, and the development of this park came out of many, many fights with developers and lots of different city administrations who dreamed lots of other things like incinerators along the waterfront instead of parks. So even just holding an imaginary space in places that other people were developing in their minds for many other uses that the community didn't want was a struggle. So when we actually got to the point of building it, Damon thought of this wonderful thing called 2 cents from 2%. In other words, how do we engage at least 2% of the population of Newark in thinking about and programming this space? So even before it was built, we were doing programs with children, we were building models, we were doing walkshops, we were doing all sorts of activities to engage a wide breadth of people from the city of Newark in the development of this park. And you can see some of the ideas here that many of the students worked on and residents throughout Newark got involved with. And then the park, actually, the other part of it that I'll talk about a little bit later is before the park got built, we also did zoning and land use changes. And this is very, very, very important because this goes back to the idea of green gentrification. And how do we protect public housing and affordable housing in areas that we know will one day get redeveloped into parkland that will be valuable. And so this was before the park gets built. We have a special waterfront zone where we downzone and we do inclusionary zoning. This is what it looked like before. This is what it looks like now. It's really beautiful, and you must come visit it. Very proud of it, and the programming that happens is also very intentional. It draws on every single culture and every single community. We have our annual Walk to the Water, where every ward in the city of Newark, which has historically been very racially segregated, comes to the waterfront and takes part in a multicultural, multi-ethnic Festival. So June 4th, if you're not doing anything, take the path. It's the best $2.50 you'll ever spend, and you're going to see all of Newark's wonderful cultures and communities come out. So that's it.
Thank you, Anna, Dylan, and Jennifer. So 3 success stories or recipes for success. My question is, to each of you, what's a takeaway of the biggest obstacle or the thing that others should be thinking of as they begin to perhaps emulate the processes or the projects that you are talking about here? What's the hardest thing to do? Anybody? Am I going to have to call on somebody?
I'll say that, once no one, this beautiful park that you see now, nobody ever dreamed that was possible. But once it gets built, then everybody is like, oh, I have a great idea for that park of yours. And so I think the biggest challenge that once you have an attractive park, something that, I think a lot of people tout this idea of economic development and, all the wonderful benefits that come with parks, but unless you have a really intentional way that communities that are part of that park are involved in that process, in those discussions that happen around development tied to parks and programming tied to parks, communities can easily get marginalized and pushed out of the future of parks. It's one thing to get it built, but then to continue to claim a stake in what happens in those parks and around those parks, I think is one of the biggest challenges, because you're up against very powerful pressures, and people sort of feel like, well, once it's built, the work is done, the hard work is done.
So how do you do that? What kind of structure do you put in place or to ensure that?
Well, one is we developed in Newark a Friends of the Park system that has constituencies from citizen groups and neighborhood organizations across the city, as well as business sector, city representatives, and that parks group becomes sort of the eyes and ears and sort of the accountability measure for what happens in those parks, and a great advocate for making sure that people aren't marginalized from that decision-making process. So that's really important, is creating a sort of a body of folks that have a stake in that are constantly on top of what's happening to the future of the park. And the second thing is zoning, and I mentioned that we were able to do it before the park was built. Many communities don't have that luxury to go in after the fact. But looking at the land use and the zoning that's planned around the park was really critical for us, because it ensured that we could have some inclusionary housing. We could protect public housing that was already on the river. So, being part of the zoning and land use decisions that are around the park is really important.
And I can add to that, I guess, a little bit from, we showed a lot of the detail that went into shaping kind of the physical footprint of the Community Parks Initiative scope, but for us, one of the key things that we knew that we needed to do was to actually put the community into the Community Parks Initiative. And we had sort of an opposite scenario where we had a lot of existing parkland that we were looking to revitalize, and ensuring that we were adding to that data-driven approach with community input. So sort of a hurdle that we had to overcome with parks was that we, I guess, believe it or not, used to host our public input meetings during the daytime, and maybe 3 or 4 people would show up. And it was really more focused on the professionals looking at what could happen at a park. I mean, of course, there were key examples, and many of those were community-led projects, or those with much bigger scopes of work. So making sure that for even a 1 acre or smaller park in a community, we were really working hard to ensure that we got people into the room for our public input meetings. And I realized there's some potential tension there, because we were we'd already decided to go to that neighborhood, but we worked with our nonprofit partnerships for parks who were really crucial in expanding our capacity to get people excited about and into the room and talking about designing their parks. And then looking ahead, we're also working with them to meet our goal for the program, which is, at least on the community engagement side, which is to establish or otherwise support an existing Friends of group. So that's a real key thing that we're trying to do in order to make sure that we're continuing to engage communities around what happens in terms of not just the design, but programming and stewardship for the park. So like one of the slides that I didn't get to show you is like that triple Venn diagram of all of the good stuff we're trying to make happen. And maybe it's good that we skipped it so you can see one less triple Venn diagram today. But the idea is really that we're trying to take a holistic approach and ensure that people have a voice in what their future parks look like.
Yeah, I think just following up on what both of you said, I think that issue of development without displacement is like really the biggest challenge in improving parks because it can have these unintended side effects. And I think what you were saying about building up the capacity for communities to have ownership of over a park and be involved in decision making through Friends of groups is really key too. But this being tied to like a larger constellation of neighborhood both issues. So on the like planning side, thinking about how parks are the avenue to being involved in conversations around public safety and public health in your community and around zoning in your community. If a Friends of group is working around a park, they might have allies in other areas that they're not even talking to, and that those connections need to be made to ensure that the long-time residents of a community don't get displaced when a park gets improved or when there is new development in and around a park in a community.
So one thing that I really haven't heard any of you speak about very much, and I want to get a quick response to, even though it's a very long conversation, is the issue of economic equity. We're living in a city where income inequality is growing, in a nation where income inequality is growing, and people are being pushed out of neighborhoods, and we're talking about bringing equity to, in terms of park amenities and parks and open space to these neighborhoods. What's the relationship between people being able to earn a livable income and stay in their neighborhoods and so forth, and the Parks Equity Initiative? In 30 seconds, please. Anybody want to address that?
I don't know if that could be answered in 30 seconds.
No, I'm kidding, but a minute.
I mean, I think it goes back to what I was just saying. There are, if the infrastructure is there, if there are groups that are organizing around issues of like economic justice and job creation in a community, there are opportunities in parks to have jobs. I mean, these parks need to be maintained. They need to be programmed. And the work that communities are doing in their neighborhood can happen in parks. It's like an opportunity to bring the identity of a neighborhood out into the limelight. So I don't think that answers the question.
Has that happened? Has that? Well, no, it does. But has that happened?
I don't think it has as much as we would like. I think we try to imbue it in things. For instance, in the Passive Pier 42 project, we were partnering with groups like Henry Street Settlement that has a GED class. So they were working with an architecture firm to build a project and learning about and being exposed to the possibility of careers in that field. So I think there are ways that can happen, but it hasn't been explored to its fullest potential, at least in my own work. So. 30 seconds.
I guess maybe two things to say is one that parks can be catalysts, right, for a lot of different kinds of activity, and whether that's seeing 500,000 kids come to our CPI programming sites and thinking about what that experience can potentially mean for them as they grow and develop, into like workers and landscape architects or whatever they're going to do in the future, and continue to work on parks and potentially become stewards. I think that the role of parks can be part of a more holistic view of what economic development can mean.
Mindy, do you want to weigh in on this? Yeah, you.
I think there's a history of parks being a place where I think Dylan, you referenced it, where people can learn work skills and gain work experience that can be very valuable to them going forward, and it often has the added benefit of helping people sort of clean and maintain and beautify their own neighborhoods, which I think instill other kinds of skills. So in terms of job opportunities, summer youth employment, things like that, the things we all sort of know about, I think parks can act as a real partner in that, and I think has, certainly in New York, and I think in other jurisdictions throughout the country.
Anna?
I'll just add that we had a dream that parks were going to become this source of job training for a lot of Newark residents that never materialized. There just wasn't the funding and the infrastructure, even within the city park system, to do that. While city employees were getting laid off, we were dreaming of more city jobs. And so that's a real issue that needs to get looked at, infrastructure issue. How are we maintaining all of our infrastructure in cities that's falling apart? And parks are part of that infrastructure. And this is at a time when the city of Newark has huge deficits, and yet voters in the city of Newark went to the polls and voted in favor of an investment tax into a trust fund for parks. So residents are still voting and trying to invest in parks at a time when they have very little resources and income. So it's a priority for people, but how are we structuring that priority and that investment to make the most of it? I don't think we're there. And maybe there's some other examples in other places that we can look at, maybe in New York City, but we certainly haven't realized that.
We have time for a few questions. Anybody have a question? Back there.
It was awkward. Do I wait for the microphone or do I not? I thought, in a conversation about parks and equity in the city, we probably should make some space to talk about NYCHA. And while I'm not an expert on any of the sort of jurisdictional subtleties there, or not an expert on the legacy of urban renewal projects in New York City, I live near Kingsborough Houses in Crown Heights, and one thing that anybody who's familiar with NYCHA developments knows that there isn't a tremendous amount of investment made in those parks. So if it's not brick and mortar, but if it's something else, what are the opportunities for investment? Who can we bring in? How can that be part of our conversation?
Jennifer, that sounds like a question for you.
Sounds like a city question. We, through CPI in particular, had an interesting time in working adjacent to NYCHA properties. So, we did find that there was some, this is like a good example of a design challenge, and one where we probably could, continue to work with NYCHA to kind of help our collective view of what open space can look like in a shared strategy. But we're also the providers of the major sort of larger recreational facilities that serve lots of NYCHA developments. So that is like I think we're achieving some degree of that work through this program, and of course we're also doing a lot of our outreach directly to NYCHA residents when those parks are being redeveloped. So I think you're right, there's a lot of additional opportunity to think more comprehensively, and that's kind of the Parks Without Borders mode of thinking and planning as well.
Other questions? Yes, Kristen.
I've got one that kind of follows on this, and it's really about, as I know you're instructed not to let go of the mic, and I promise to be brief. You've been talking a lot about building new parks, but obviously a big part of equity is just maintaining the parks, right? And people have talked throughout the day about, the inequity of not maintaining low-income parks, low-income communities' parks. So my question is to the city about, how are you tracking this? How are you reallocating resources? Are there now better facilities? Is the trash picked up more often? Are the light bulbs replaced? in low-income community parks?
Yeah, that's also a great question. And I think when we talk to communities, that's high on the list. So not just we want new play equipment and we want a rain garden, but also like, can you put some lights in here and, you know, fix the comfort station and make sure that we have sort of state of good repair work going on. We're doing that in a couple of ways, I guess, through CPI again. The first is that through city council funding, we were able to hire 150 new gardeners and maintenance workers, and we wanted to make sure that those individuals were, you know, placed within the neighborhoods where our capital projects were. You know, so like, of course, the impact of one individual worker is hard to talk about and hard to measure, but we do have, especially on the horticulture side, a lot of really highly visible projects that have transformed some of our spaces that have previously not had the kind of green that that other neighborhoods do. So that's been a really exciting component of that. And then the other side is that we've been doing these sort of targeted improvement projects that, for like, especially the operations and borough commissioners in the room, you know that they're not quick fixes, but they're as quick as we can do. And we're doing sports coating and painting and repairing play equipment and ensuring that, you know, in a short period of time, we're able to kind of increase the level of maintenance in a really targeted way. So we ended up spending about $1 million worth of in-house maintenance resources in CPI neighborhoods to kind of provide that broader, more holistic, again, I keep saying that word, but we're trying to think about what happens at the community scale. So that's one step forward, and we hope to continue to concentrate our efforts in that way.
Any other questions? All right, well, I have a sort of a follow-up to Kristen's. We work together, so we think alike, you know, sometimes. So you're talking a lot about brick and mortar improvements, whether it's refurbishing parks or just maintaining them better. How important is that to the success of the programmatic elements that all of you have also spoken about, whether it's recreation programs or GED programs or whatever it is, you know, building human capital, building community relations, building a sense of community. How important is it to have a park where where all the lights work and where the lawns are properly seeded and all? I mean, is that like an essential component, or can you do it without that?
Well, I think it's great if the lights work. I think that's very important.
I think we all agree on that.
I think so that kind of should be a baseline in some cases, but you know, if the community is there and they're excited to be involved in the park, I think that's almost more important than some of the capital conditions of a park, as long as it is safe and it does have, you know, lighting at night. So I think, like, sort of following up on the last question and your answer there, just in addition to making sure all of these investments are made on the capital side, I think there needs to be an investment on the social side and building up the infrastructure of communities where there isn't that infrastructure. And I think that's a lot of the work that Partnerships for Parks does in terms of building the capacity of stewardship groups to do that kind of work. But it can't just be people who are excited about parks. You know, it can't be siloed into just the parkies. You know, it has to be open to the other community groups that are using parks that might not be necessarily caring for it through gardening or park cleanup or those kinds of activities. But like, you know, groups that want to have a barbecue, you know, that are going to have a stake in their park and using it as a platform for other conversations. So I guess that being said, like we want to encourage that kind of investment in the social infrastructure of neighborhoods as well.
Okay, and I think that's a great place to end the conversation because we are out of time. Investment in the social infrastructure of neighborhoods. That's a beautifully put phrase. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to all of you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the day.